Welcome everyone to our Madison Tableau user group meeting today. Each meeting we rotate the meeting leaders for the event just to give us all a chance to speak to you all and come up with some great content and presentations for you. So today's meeting leaders is myself, Sarah Weber, pictured here on the left, and then we have Sarah Schneider also. We are two Sarahs both from American Family Insurance. There's actually a third Sarah from American Family Insurance on our leadership team. So the running joke is, if you work at American Family, your name is Sarah, you have no choice but to be on the leadership team. We're happy to have you all here today to join us. You'll hear from me mostly on the slides today. Sarah is coming fresh from maternity leave, the other Sarah. And so we're letting her ease back into leadership duties, but she helped pull the content together and supply some entertainment through our newest data fan member, her new son, Justin. So more to come on that throughout today's presentation. So today's agenda, we're just going to have a few slides welcoming you like we're doing right now. We'll have a couple of Zoom poll questions. And Jen Shepard from our leadership team is going to talk about some fun social activities as well. Then we'll jump right into our two awesome speakers, Olivia and Lee, and then wrap things up with, of course, some giveaways. Most important thing about the giveaways is engagement. Join us in the chat, ask questions. We want this to be as interactive as possible, as things can be in Zoom. With this many people, it can be a challenge. So ask questions, engage, talk to one another, and all your engagements will help get you into a drawing for e-learning gift certificates for a year of e-learning from Tableau. So first poll of the day and first introduction to Justin, our newest data fan member in the Madison tug. We want to hear from you. We're going to trigger a Zoom poll here asking, what's your mood today? How are you feeling as it relates to cutie Justin here on the screen? So I'm going to kick that off. Hopefully you're all seeing the poll. Looks good. We've got a bunch of results coming in. Not too many sleepy folks. You're not in the afternoon slump yet. That's great. I'll share the results when we close out the question. But lots of people who are just chilling and ready to take it all in today, which is great. Glad to have you all here. Let me give you some perspective. So 57% of you are ready to take it all in. Another 30% just excited and ready to be here, and a handful who just need a little pick me up. So hopefully some of today's topics will be engaging for you and perk you up a little bit. All right. Advance my slide here. So our mood as a leadership team is just a little sad because we're missing you all, and being virtual all the time is hard, as we all know. So we're hoping that there might be some opportunities to do some more networking and engagement with all of you. So with that, I'm going to turn over some talking points to Jen Shepard, who is, I like to call her our social director at the Madison Touch, through a few items that we wanted to share with you today.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, hi everybody, Jen Shepard here. So we're not quite ready to start having in-person meetings, even though we know it's been a really long time. February of 2020 was our last in-person, but we thought with vaccination rates improving and COVID cases down, it's summer weather, we can be outside. We were thinking it might be fun to all get together and do a networking / happy hour event at an outdoor patio somewhere in the Madison area, probably sometime in July. So what we're wanting to hear from you is, are you comfortable with this idea? If you're not, that's completely fine. So we're going to kick off another poll question here to just get a sense of if you're interested. So we have a couple of specific locations picked out that we know have ample parking. They have outdoor patio. And then if you like either of those in particular, go ahead and vote for them. If you're not local, if you could just maybe sit the entire poll out, that would be really helpful so that our disinterested group doesn't look disproportionately large. And if you have a super favorite location that's not listed here and you want to recommend it in the chat, that would be great. So go ahead and put those thoughts in the chat. So far, it's actually looking like most people are interested in this idea, which is so exciting. We would love to see you all. So first drink, maybe a couple drinks would be on us, probably get some snacks, and hopefully see as many of you as possible. So I know not everybody has voted yet, but it's looking pretty clear to me that this group would like to get together, and that's great.
Very good. I'll close out that poll.
So yes, most people don't particularly care where it's at. And again, if you've got another suggestion, again, parking is really important, and so is an ample patio space, preferably with some shade, seeing as we're coming into the hotter part of the summer. All right, perfect. So that's that item. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some volunteering. So if you've been a member of our TUG for a while, you know that one of my favorite things to do with this group is to get us involved with our local community and doing some volunteering. So we have been working with local nonprofits, getting their data, building vizzes just for them. But I wanted to try something a little different this year where I would secure a data set and we would have maybe 3 hours, something like that, Visathon, where anyone who participated would get the data set, you just explore the data, build some things, and then we'd share that back with the organization instead of it stretching over an extended period of time. So one question we have for you is, does that sound interesting? Would you be interested in participating in a viz? You don't have to be an expert. We'd be happy to work with you. We can pair you up with somebody who's more expert. So just general interest, would you be interested in that type of event? And we could either do it exclusively virtual, we could have potentially an in-person location, but you could come in virtually if you wanted. So we can explore what the logistics of that look like. This is mostly just trying to get a sense of, do we have people out there who might participate in that? Topic, we don't have anything in mind at the moment. It could be something health related. We know that the Social Viz for Good group has data sets and those are usually health related, so we could potentially join them in their effort. So we definitely need to think a little bit more about what this would include, but just trying to get a temperature check here. But I'm seeing that actually quite a few people are interested, so that's great. So we will be back with more about this option soon. The other volunteering, so we have been to the Munch program. This is with the River Food Pantry. They do several things, but one of the activities we've participated in as a TUG is creating lunches, I should say assembling lunches for low-income children primarily, but low-income families. So you gather in the morning, make a whole bunch of sandwiches, hundreds of sandwiches, and then there's an afternoon shift that actually goes to multiple neighborhoods in the northern part of Madison, and the kids come to that location and they pick up their lunch. So we're wondering if people would be interested in doing something like that in the next couple of months. So we would sign up for a particular shift. We would be looking at weekends. And I think the morning shift accommodates about 10 people and the afternoon shift's about 4. So depending on level of interest, we might sign us up for more than one session. The delivery is primarily outside. The sandwich making would be inside. Last time I checked, they were still requiring masks for that, and you could certainly wear one the whole time if you were so inclined. So we would certainly want everybody to feel safe and be safe. So we'll certainly take all that into account as well. But it does look like we've got some interest. That's great. Love to see the generosity and giving of this group. So it looks like September, October is a little more popular for those who have a preference. So what I'll do is check the calendar and I'll book us for a day or two, and then we'll announce that, and it'll just be first come, first served as to who signs up for those shifts. Fabulous, thank you. And then the next item, so at one of the Wisconsin TUG meetings, one of our audience members thought it could be kind of fun to all do a watch party for this movie Coded Bias. So we've been talking about that as a leadership team. And Coded Bias, if you're not familiar, is a documentary that came out a couple years ago, actually was at the Sundance Film Festival in January of 2020. It's about a woman who worked at the MIT Media Lab and discovered that the facial recognition software she was working with was not seeing dark-skinned faces, including her own. And so she starts down this journey of raising the alarm and then ultimately pushing for legislation, first ever legislation about these biases and algorithms. And so the documentary includes her, but also other people working on this type of software. I think it includes some legislators. It includes Kathy O'Neill, who wrote a book about a similar topic, Weapons of Mass Destruction. So it's about algorithms and how they are not always working in the way that you would want. Sorry, that was really unclear, but that's what the movie is about. So our question for you is, would you be interested in seeing it as a group? Would you be interested in watching it on your own and we would just maybe host a discussion about it? Or the deluxe package, would you want us to provide the movie? There is a cost associated with that, which we'd be happy to cover if there's interest. And we could even schedule the filmmaker, the director, to do a Q&A with this group. So we wanted to gauge your interest because those things do cost money and we don't want to spend our resources irresponsibly if there isn't a lot of interest there. But I am seeing kind of split evenly between those who are not particularly interested and those who want to do the deluxe package. So we will take that under advisement. Timing is going to be very dependent on when the filmmaker is available. We might be looking at something soon in the next few weeks. The movie itself is an hour and a half long, and then the Q&A would be another additional hour. So it is a bit of a time commitment. So we'll probably follow up with some more questions about the timing on this, but thank you for letting us know your thoughts on that. And then the last item for me is we've been thinking, we get Tableau branded swag, which is awesome, and we love giving that out at our meetings. We've been doing these e-learning certificates because they're really easy to give out virtually and really helpful for people trying to advance their Tableau knowledge. But we thought, how cool would it be? Oh, thank you, Sarah. I forgot we had that question. Doesn't have date, but just time of day. So while you all are responding to that, I know we're running behind here. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the designs. So we thought it'd be super cool if we had some designs that were specific to our tug, the Madison tug, and we could then order some t-shirts or maybe some mugs or various items that we could give out at meetings, or perhaps people could order their own if they were so inclined. But it's really challenging to come up with really awesome designs, even as dashboard designers. So we would love your help in this. So we started a Slack channel in our Wisconsin Tug Slack site where people can post designs. Once we get several, we might do a vote on there. So we're just putting out the call. If you are artistically minded or just creative in general, and you want to help us come up with some designs that we could put on some items that's specific to us, we would love your help with it. So here's a couple of examples to just get you thinking about the kinds of things we're looking for. And please join us on the Slack channel and send us your ideas. The bigger the pool to choose from, the better. So thank you for that. And I think that's it for me. Back to you, Sarah.
Yep. All right. So as we transition to the main part of our meeting and our first speaker, I want you to just imagine for a moment. Maybe you can relate to this scenario. So if your customers ever give you a look like this, it just might be the right time to consider learning about how maybe you can embed your tools in an alternate place, maybe on a website or otherwise, as opposed to having to navigate through sometimes a challenging Tableau server environment. That's going to look different for everybody in your companies. You have a Tableau server, but lucky for us, we have just the gal to talk to us today. Olivia Butler is here with us and joining us in the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. You may remember Olivia from a presentation she did a few meetings ago, sharing information about how the state, the DHS has responded to COVID and how Tableau has helped them in that journey. So with that, I'm going to pass it right over to Olivia. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am so excited to be here today, and give me just a second to get my presentation shared. Okay. All right. Move this out of the way for you. So today we're talking about embedding Tableau server content. My name is Olivia Butler. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the lovely introduction. I'm the data management liaison at the Department of Health Services here in Wisconsin. And one of my primary responsibilities for DHS is serving as a site administrator and also a role that we created called the department publisher. So that's not a role you're going to find on the rest of the Tableau documentation, but it's a role that DHS felt that we needed because I would say if I was estimating over 90% of our content is embedded rather than shared on our Tableau server instance. That's partially because we're responsible for sharing data with the public, but we also use embedding for internal facing dashboards, things that we're sharing with just our staff at DHS as well. And so the department publisher role is a gatekeeper role to make sure that all of the reviews and approvals have been completed and everything's put in the right place to be able to share that content. So today I want to talk through how to do the embedding, but also design considerations, tips and tricks, and things that will help you determine whether embedding is the right option for you, first of all, and also make sure that your content is embedded in an intuitive way that makes it easier on your users instead of more difficult. So I want to dive right in to the biggest question of all, which is why would I embed my dashboards? Why wouldn't I want to share my dashboards on Tableau server? And we talked about it just a little bit a second ago, but for me, it really comes into three separate categories: convenience, for marketing reasons, and for technical reasons. It's convenient for users who are accessing associated content, text, forms, documentation, in a different application to also see their data with that associated content. It makes it a lot easier for them to be able to interact with that content and find everything in one place instead of having to go to multiple different locations. You also potentially are going to run into users that are not technically savvy or data literate, and the server interface, as we mentioned, can be unfamiliar and intimidating to people who aren't used to interacting in that environment. And if your server is not well managed, honestly, it can be extremely confusing for them to find the right thing at the right time. I also think in a lot of cases, especially when you're developing for the public, you want to provide additional context. You're rarely just embedding a dashboard and saying, here you go, figure it out. You want to provide information about technical notes and associated resources. And, oh, you had a question because of this data element. Here's how and why we developed it the way we did. That leads into the second bucket that I put the reason why embed into, which is marketing. And when you embed your content, you can embed data into your marketing strategy for your public audiences. So you can share on social media, you can share in your web interface, you can keep promotional campaign information together. And it also allows you to control the design options. So it allows you to put outlines or remove a toolbar and make other adjustments to your dashboard to create a consistent look and feel or brand for your data that you're sharing. I also think it's important internally for marketing data to your staff. If your staff start to expect that when they go to a web page, they get all of the text information, non-data associated content with the data, then they start to ask for more data for their non-data content. They want to combine it together and they start expecting that when they go to a web page, they're not just getting a bunch of text information, they're also getting the dashboard with the text, the data with the text. And that can help drive data-driven decision-making in your organization. The last bucket is a very practical one, which is the technical reason. If you have an extremely high traffic server environment, allowing the application to take over rendering the visualization or utilizing the built-in caching features within a Tableau server so that your users aren't hitting your server to be able to access the content, they're hitting the web page or the SharePoint site. And the other technical reason is especially in licensed environments where it's user-based. So every user who accesses your content has to have a client access license to be able to authenticate in to that environment. You can avoid that step. You don't have to license 6,000 employees. You license the 2,000 that are doing the developing and publishing work, and then you share that content in a different application and use trusted authentication or your guest account permissions, which we'll talk about in a bit, to share that content and keep that traffic off of your server. So a lot of people think embedding, okay, that's the end of my design process. I'm done. I've done my development work. I have all of my reviews and approvals. I'm ready to share my content with an internal or an external audience. But I strongly believe that you need to start thinking about embedding at the very beginning of that development process when you're thinking about the rest of your design considerations. So as always, right, you have to consider your audience first. Are the majority of your users going to access your dashboard on a tablet or mobile device? If so, it's probably worth it for you to consider building a custom mobile layout or a tablet layout, or perhaps even a device-specific one. Like if all of your staff members have iPhones assigned to them and you know they're going to be accessing your dashboard on an iPhone 11, design for an iPhone 11. You also want to think about the environment that you're going to be embedding this content in. Are you embedding in a location that has specific height and width requirements? So for example, on a full web page, usually you can go up to 1,000 pixels wide with your dashboard, but it is the most annoying thing to be completely through with your development and through your reviews and approvals and have to resize your entire dashboard, adjust containers and adjust padding to make it fit where you want it to go. So thinking about what your restrictions are in your application at the very beginning of your design process will help you have a smoother review and approval and publishing process at the end. And then again, data literacy. This is so important, but if you're going to be sharing content with the public, you want to think about what additional context does my dashboard need? What additional pieces of information do I need to make my public be able to understand what I'm displaying? And I think that, you don't always want to have to include all of that in your dashboard itself. And so you get additional flexibility embedding it in a web location like we do here at DHS to provide that additional context without taking up valuable space on your dashboard. I strongly encourage everyone to always add an update date too. You should always monitor your server environment from the administration side. But when you add an update date, you create a sense of consistency with your users where they start looking to say, okay, did the data update yet today? And that's really important to not only get them involved and feel engaged with the data itself, but oftentimes our users will be the first people to notice that there's something wrong with our system. Hey, my dashboard was supposed to update at 9 a.m., but it's showing a bunch of 0 values. Why is it doing that? And our update date actually helps our users help us keep our server up and running and everything working appropriately the way you would expect it to. And the last question you should ask yourself seems a bit strange because we're talking today about interactive visualizations shared in electronic applications, but you should think about whether your users will print your visualization or not. Obviously, we know design best practices say never use color as a distinguishing mark for accessibility reasons. But if you're designing, especially internal facing content, a lot of times users want a tangible printout to take into a meeting with them. And with COVID, that's a little changed, right? But usually people are gonna, if you allow them to, will print your visualizations to share and talk about and make notes on because it's familiar to them. So if they're going to be printing, they're probably going to be printing in grayscale. And you should think about that when you're designing your dashboard to make sure that your dashboard looks visually appealing in color when it's embedded in the application. But when somebody goes to share that content, print it off, it also is readable and shareable in that format as well. So the other big thing about your design considerations that you need to think about is planning for mobile layouts. And I have 2 examples on the slide for you today as in my mind, really your 2 options for device accessibility in Tableau. The first we call scaling to 100%. I'm sure there's probably a better word for it, but that's the way we refer to it here at DHS. And that essentially sets your width to scale to 100% of the device width that's accessing your dashboard. So regardless of what device it is, your dashboard will display as much space as it possibly can with the width of your device. So here I've taken 2 snips from my phone looking at our vaccine data on our DHS webpage. And on the left, that's really what 100% scaling is going to look like. You're only going to see what's in that part of the dashboard when you scale to 100%. On the right, we have a custom built layout where we've made some modifications to the way we're displaying the desktop version so that there's a custom mobile layout and there's a vertical scroll instead of a horizontal scroll for your user. It depends. Honestly, in my opinion, there's pros and cons to both of these options, which you want to do. But I would recommend if you don't have a lot of time and you don't have a lot of ability to go back and forth, or you're rushing to get something out the door, to go with 100% scaling and delete your phone layout altogether. This will give your users access to the content, but not require you to go through the nitpicky back and forth of fixing your mobile layout so that it looks right in the application when you're under pressure. I also really strongly recommend that you don't use default mobile layouts. The reason I like the default mobile layouts that kind of every time you create a dashboard, you're going to see that phone layout pop up. That layout is great for giving you an idea of how to reorganize your desktop layout into a mobile layout, but it doesn't understand your data the way you do. And it's a common misconception that whatever's on your desktop has to be in your mobile layout. I think the data that's on the desktop should be available on mobile for accessibility reasons, but there's no reason that you have to put a trend line of 3 years in a mobile layout. You could filter it by date and show the last week in the mobile version in a custom view just for your mobile layout. And I think that keeping that in mind, that your desktop visualization doesn't necessarily mean it's the best for the mobile, is really important when you're building these custom phone layouts. You also have to think about the fact that, as you can see here, when a user goes to my phone, accesses the data on their phone, they're only able to see a specific piece of your dashboard. So there's a lot of really great eye tracking studies and design best practices. And I do link to some of the key findings from the eye tracking in the resources section of this presentation. But things like the users usually look at the top most left corner of your dashboard really come into play when you're looking at mobile layouts. Because as you can see on the left, everything that they can see is in that top left corner. Those are the 2 most important pieces of data that they should get from that dashboard. The other thing to consider is, as you can see on the left here, and I'll just kind of try and use my mouse to show you, the legend's sort of cut off, which visually isn't the best. We like the custom mobile layout over here, obviously a lot better, but it indicates to the user that there is additional content to the right. If you have a blank space here, when you're doing 100% scaling, if you're designing for a general audience or an audience that maybe isn't super familiar with your content, they're not going to know that they can scroll right to see additional data. So you want to think about all of those pieces. And then my last piece of advice for mobile layouts is to avoid storyboards. They're wonderful. I have nothing against storyboards personally, but when you try and take that much information and put it on a mobile layout, or you try and scale it, navigating through the story points is incredibly difficult for most audiences, because you have to remember that you're really in a tap functionality when you're on a tablet or a mobile phone, and that navigation becomes incredibly important to improve your user experience. Okay, one last thing to think about before we get to how to actually embed these dashboards. And you have to think about permissions before you're ready to publish. The first thing that you should always ask yourself is, where is my server located? If your server is located behind a firewall, then even if you turn on guest account, which will allow users to see your content without authenticating into server, only people that are on the network that lives behind that firewall will be able to see it, even if you turn on guest account. So make sure you have the right environment for hosting and sharing that information. And that's the first place that you should start. Do I have the right location for who I want to share it with? The next question you should ask yourself is, what level of access is appropriate for my content? Is my data sensitive? Should I restrict it to just a specific amount of users and not turn on guest account? Do my users need to be able to download a PDF or an image of my visualization? Do they need the full data or just the summary data? And thinking through what is helpful for your users is really important at this step, because if you leave the toolbar on the bottom of your visualization, they're going to have access to whatever you set in the permissions on your server side. The other thing to consider, and what we obviously do, I showed an image down here at the bottom, we generally embed our dashboards for the public, which means we don't want them to be able to add comments to the content itself. So we disable their ability to add comments to the dashboard, because there's other mechanisms for them to provide that feedback. Whether or not you allow your data to be downloaded from your visualization obviously starts at the very beginning with a sensitivity question. Should your users be able to see that data? Is it de-identified? And then it goes into more structural questions. For example, when you're building a dashboard, most of the elements contained in your dashboard are not going to be as accessible on assistive devices like screen readers, which means that your data download is the only way a user with a screen reader is going to be able to see the data in your visualization. You also have to think about complicated data sets that have been de-identified to meet sensitivity requirements. Panel data, when it's de-identified, is incredibly difficult for a lay audience or an audience that's not particularly data literate to view and interact and understand. So certain types of data may be better served in a different format, such as providing that data through an open data portal or a zip file available for download. And that also allows you to control the field names and values for the data that's being downloaded. I always tell people that they should test as a guest, and we'll talk about that more in a bit, but you should test at the level of access that your users will have. So are your users going to know to click into the dashboard to be able to download the data? Are your users going to understand if a percent is displayed as a decimal instead of with the percent sign? Will they know what your technical column name means relative to plain language column titles for your data values? And I think you really need to look at your source data and evaluate your different options, because in my opinion, your answer to will users download data should always be yes. It's for accessibility reasons. But how they download it, you can really control with extensions or alternative ways for them to get that data. And when you're embedding, the beauty is adding a link for a zip file download becomes extremely easy, because you do that right in the page with a hyperlink instead of having to worry about how to get button functionality into your dashboard, for example. All right. We've gotten through the hard part. We've done our development. We've done our thinking. We know exactly what we want to do and where it should be embedded. Now we should think about how we're going to embed it. What are the parameters? What type of code are we going to use? And DHS, like I said earlier, uses Tableau server. You can obviously use Tableau public or online as well to get your embed codes or your links. And there's really two types of embeds at the end of the day. There's an iframe embed, which is demonstrated at the bottom of the screen here, and a JavaScript embed, which is a JavaScript-based code that you can use within your web interfaces. JavaScript you should use is always the preferred approach, in my opinion, because you have so much more control over the parameters and the functionality within your embed. And as long as you're in an application that you're embedding this in will accept JavaScript, I say go with that. If you have a reason that you can only use the view link, or you can not use JavaScript in your application, that's when I would go look at an iframe as your option for embedding. We'll look at some examples of the iframe and JavaScript embed codes here in a second, but there's a couple of other tips and tricks that I want to share with you when you're embedding your content. The first is use your favorites. I think people underutilize favorites and server, or maybe don't utilize them in a consistent way. I like to use my favorites in my server environment to identify which dashboard is actually the one that's embedded in the location where it's intended, whether that's SharePoint or an internet site or a different application. And that way, if I need to troubleshoot, as soon as I log into server, I've got every single dashboard that's embedded or in production somewhere, and I can click immediately into that workbook and investigate and see what's going on with it. You also, again, need to think about the environment where you plan to embed your content. So for example, at DHS, we use a JavaScript injector in our Drupal web pages that allows us to take the script tag from the embed and put it in a place so that it only calls once on a page. If you use the script tag and you have 5 visualizations embedded on a page and you're not using an injector, your web page will call 5 times back to server every single time that page is loaded. We use a JavaScript injector so we can specify that call at the page URL level. So if I have 50 dashboards on a page, my JavaScript injector is only going to make the call to my server once. And that's especially important in environments where you have really high traffic or a lot of turnover. Again, test as a guest. You should not be signed into server. You should not be signed into your application if you're testing guest accounts. You want to make sure that you're seeing what they're seeing, so that if there's any weird prompting for login because of a permissions issue or data is not displaying appropriately, you know before you go live that something's wrong. And if you're logged into those applications, especially if you have higher permissions in those applications, you may see additional content, or it won't display the same way it displays when you're viewing it logged out. And finally, think about subscriptions. Again, especially in high traffic environments, setting up a subscription for your visualization will not only, let you notify your users when there's a change to the content that's embedded, which kind of helps encourage engagement and them, oh, yay, my data is updated. I'm going to go check that out now. But it also forces the Tableau visualization cache to clear in your server location. So if I set up a subscription at 2 p.m. because my data updates at 1:50, that forces the viz cache to clear at 2 p.m. so that I can see the current day's data and any other modifications that were made prior to that subscription clearing the cache. Otherwise, especially in high traffic areas, the VizQL server is going to cache your visualization. So it will display the old data and until it has time to update that when there's more space available on your server. So here's a JavaScript embed code. It looks maybe intimidating to some of you that haven't worked with it before, but we're going to break it down and hopefully make it very clear. So the first piece is the JavaScript injector. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is the piece of your embed code that makes the call to Tableau server to allow your application to render the visualization in wherever you're locating it. These two pieces here are your width and your height for both the div container for your dashboard and your actual dashboard. When you grab an embed code, it's going to grab the width and the height that you set in your desktop application. But here is where I would change 800 to say 100% if I wanted it to scale 100% instead of using a phone layout. You can also make minor adjustments to the width and the height if you want to increase white space between elements on a web page or your application where you're embedding it, or maybe reduce some additional space that is available on the dashboard, but your users don't really need to see. But you should always double check, again, test as a guest, to make sure that you're not introducing horizontal or vertical scroll bars within your visualization if you're making adjustments in the embed code rather than in the dashboard itself. This section down here are parameters for your embed code, and I did include a URL. I'll share these slides with everybody later, and there are literally hundreds of parameters that you can specify, so I'm not going to go through them all today. But essentially what the parameters allow you to do is specify specific aspects of your dashboard that you want to display or not display. For example, if I don't want the toolbar at the bottom of the visualization to show up, I change this to no. You can also say that you want it at the top instead of the bottom. You have some flexibility to specify how your dashboard looks when it's embedded by modifying these parameters in the embed code. And here's an example of the JavaScript embed. This is some of our COVID-19 visualizations from DHS. And what I wanted to point out here is we've allowed the toolbar to be here because, again, accessibility reasons, we want people to be able to download the data from this viz. And we've also used some web components like these two accordions to explain what people are looking at when they look at this data and any technical notes that are associated with the visualization so that we didn't have to take up space in our embed to display that information. We could put it in the web page itself and keep our visualization a lot cleaner. It also allowed us to write in plain language and in a way that screen readers would be able to access that information if they were not visually viewing our dashboard. So now we have an iframe embed. We're going to go through the same process here. I did do something a little different here. And the div align to div container here is just asking the iframe to float to the right of the page, which will allow text wrapping around the left side of the visualization. That is actually outside of the iframe code for the dashboard itself. So the dashboard itself actually starts with the iframe piece right here. And the piece highlighted in yellow is your link that you would grab from your view to put into the iframe code. However, there's a little tip and trick here where if you want, your view is actually a URL up into the point of that question mark. Everything after the question mark are URL parameters that can be modified the same way we modify parameters for a JavaScript embed. There's slightly different options of what's available to you, but this is linked here as well for you to look at and investigate later. And in this case, we're asking it to not show the toolbar, and because we want the dashboard to really feel like it's a part of the page. And then here, you only have one width and height to modify. Most of the time when I'm using iframe embeds in our use cases, we're not modifying to 100% scaling because we want a specific width and height, and we're using iframes to make it feel like it's a part of the story on the page. So here's an example of that. We have floated the dashboard to the right, and we've removed the toolbar, so it feels like the dashboard is a part of the page rather than a separate element. And this is important if you're trying to think about building stories for a general audience and you want the majority of your information to be in an accessible format, rather than putting all of this text in the dashboard, which may be hard for users to access or navigate. We've moved that text into the surrounding web page and added the dashboard as an image, almost like an image, but it's still interactive within the page. Okay, you have your embed, something inevitably goes wrong, and now you need to troubleshoot. What do you need to do? The first thing you should always check is adjusting the application permissions to your server. If your application doesn't have the ability to call to your server, firewall rules, whatever other security permissions might be in place, you need to double check to make sure that that call is actually being allowed in that environment. You also want to think about whether the users have the right level of permission to access that content. So for example, at DHS, we utilize a VPN for most of our work. And if a user is not signed into VPN, they can't see the visualization in our UAT Drupal environment when it's embedded in a web page. So think about application permissions and security rules first. Then, if that's not the problem, go to modify server to make sure that the permissions are embedded at the workbook and the view level. If Tableau has to process, okay, they don't have access to the workbook, but they do have access to the specific view, it's going to slow the way it renders on the page. If you set the permissions at the workbook and the view level the same, then Tableau's like, okay, I checked, guests can see this, we're going to show the visualization on the page. Also, always double check your firewall rules. If your server can't call to your data source or your application can't call to your server, you may have to put some exemptions in place for your firewall to allow those connections to happen. You want to modify your embed if the content size is changed, name changes, or location changes. That's the modifying the code in the application. This will happen a lot if somebody renames their workbook or publishes to a different location and server. And I think you really want to encourage people to publish over your existing embed whenever possible, just for server management best practices, but that doesn't always happen. And you may need to make modifications to the actual embed code to reflect those changes that might be happening in the desktop application itself. You also have to remember that your embed code represents your dashboard at the time it was embedded. Changes to that content down the road mean changes to your embed code. Finally, you may want to have your SME or your owner of the content republish. Most often I find that if they're using a server data source and they published it without specifying that the password was embedded in the connection, it's going to keep prompting users to log in, even if you've enabled guest account at the workbook and the view level. Also, you should have the owners double check always if there's an issue with actually the underlying data. Sometimes it's not your server, sometimes it's not your application, it's the actual source data or something's corrupted in the workbook and they may need to modify it from there. The meme is supposed to be funny, but it's also a helpful tip and trick for everybody here. Get in a habit when you're testing in your browsers for SharePoint or a web application of always doing a Control F plus F5 refresh. So hit Control, hit F5, and that will force your application to clear the cache when you refresh. Because if Chrome is particularly fun with this, Chrome loves to cache too, and Tableau server loves to cache. So if you're doing back and forth modifying your embed code, Control F5 refreshes, make sure you're looking at the most recent and modern version of whatever content you've embedded in your application. And I think just getting into that habit of always using Control F5 instead of hitting the refresh button at the top of the browser will help make sure that you're actually looking at the right version of the content that you're using. So with that, I'll open it up to questions and discussions. I see that there's been some chats happening throughout this presentation, and I haven't had a chance to look yet, but I will open the floor to you all. And I've included my email here as well. If you're running into specific troubleshooting issues or you want to talk about how to embed within your organization, I'm always more than happy to help and walk through in whatever way I can.
Very good. Thanks, Olivia. There were a couple of questions, and of course you weren't reading through them because you were doing a great presentation. A couple of questions early on about permissions. I think you covered most of that and with guest access, but John, feel free to chime in again with any other questions or reach out to Olivia, like she mentioned. There were some questions about making sure that the pages are responsive. You talked a little bit about that, but do you have any additional comments on that?
Yeah, I will say, we've run into some issues, and I think that it might be just because of the environments that we're using, but we have run into some issues. Our web page is responsive, but the script that is being called doesn't recognize that the page is responsive. So we have been independently dealing with responsivity in the script itself, rather than trying to get the Tableau script to interact with our responsive web page and utilize the web page instead. I think that in more modern infrastructure, that might not be a problem for everyone, but I think that you should approach responsivity from the Tableau side. And, if you're lucky enough that your application is handling that responsivity for you, that's great. But in a lot of situations, especially if you're in a situation like I am, where we're kind of working on outdated infrastructure, you can't rely on the responsivity built into the application to control that for you. It's not going to work. It still wants you to scale to 100% or make the actual element that's in the page responsive as well as the page being responsive.
Got it. Thanks. Well, with that, I think we're going to close out. We're going to transition over to Lee. There is another question, Olivia, if you might want to just quick check in the chat. It was fairly recent about some accessibility thoughts that if you have a chance and could look at that, maybe you could respond in the chat.
Will do. Thank you all.
All right. So let's jump back here. Okay. Are you seeing an adorable baby on the screen? Got Justin, I hope so. As we get ready to introduce our next speaker, Lee Feinberg, I think it's time we hear from Justin just one more time, thinking maybe he can teach us a few things about language. And I don't know, maybe you feel like your approach to translating data and insights into visualization could sometimes come across something like this. So I hope not, even though that's adorable. We don't want to be adorable with our customers, right? Lucky again for us, we have an expert here on board to chat with us today about the language of visualization. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lee Feinberg, who is president of Decision Viz, and he's here to chat with us about the language of visualization. So thanks.
All right, let me get this going. So I don't know if that was, to me, was more like the wonderment, of what the child is expressing. So let's fire this up. So Justin, thank you for the introduction. And I think I just have to share my screen here. Great. So yes, I want to talk to you about the language of visualization and some of the things that you may encounter in your work every day. And you can think about this, whether it's Tableau, Excel, PowerPoint, or any other kind of way that you're trying to express information visually. And I'm located out here in central New Jersey, where we've got a great day. So for all of you that enjoy the outdoors, I'll be hopefully getting on a nice long bike ride sometime a little bit later, and maybe we can find each other on Strava. All right, so I want to hit you with this one idea before we get into anything else. The frustrations that you may feel they're not your fault. And I want to show you a few ways that you can put an end to some of the misery that you might be experiencing. Because if you're like I was, and even still experience sometimes, you put your energy, your mental power into creating a dashboard. And then at the end of the day, you're not seeing people get the insights out of it that you expected, and maybe the engagement's very low. And for some reason, other people aren't seeing the value in it, and you put all this work into it, and it is frustrating. And I felt that same way many, many years ago. And I wanted to find ways to advance my skills, but more importantly, work smarter and achieve better results. And I've been researching this for more than a decade and building practical solutions. And I'm going to share some of that with you today. So in about the next 20 minutes or so, I hope that you'll be able to pick a few things out of this conversation and start making changes for yourself, and hopefully start knocking this problem down to size. So I'll give you a few tools, a few things you can follow step by step. And when thinking about this, it doesn't matter, what level you're at with your work, because this is going to start to save you time and let you have more impact. And I'm going to cover 3 ideas that I think will really change the way you think about data visualization. And I know that maybe it sounds a little bit dramatic, but I've seen this change happen with my peers, with my clients. And not only does it help their companies, but it can really has helped their careers. And we'll have a few minutes at the end, of course, for Q&A, but as we've said, feel free to jot those down into the chat as we go along. Now, I'm really proud of a lot of things I've done over the years. I've been working with Tableau since 2009. In fact, I was even a Tableau user group leader for about 8.5 years and a Tableau ambassador. But this year, over this last year, I've done something that I'm really proud of, which is helping James Madison University through all of their COVID work. And my daughter is a student there. So I'm not sure if she was embarrassed by my dealing with that or not, but they just posted in their magazine that they actually send out physically a nice spread article about that work. So I love doing work with other organizations and have helped a lot, even with the Tableau Foundation. But beside all of that, to be successful with data visualization requires more than being good at Tableau. And I think I've heard this term a few times today, data literate. And that's really what I focus my work around, is data literacy. And so hopefully some of these ideas that I share will really be able to help you. So here are those 3 things that I mentioned. 1, visualization is a language that you have to learn. It's not the working of the software. There are rules, there's guidelines, and there's even strategies around it. And like any other language, you have to practice it. The second thing is that your brain has automatic functions to decode visual patterns. The thing is that the brain gets confused when it doesn't see those expected patterns. So we're going to talk about how do you know what those patterns are and how to make sure you can do them in the right way. And the third thing is what I call the 5 foundation visual traits that make up most of the dashboards that you or I might be working with. There's going to be a lot of other elements, of course, but these are the ones that are most common. And as I mentioned, keep in mind that even though we're going to be talking about Tableau and looking at some Tableau examples, you can apply these principles to anything that you do. I know a lot of people will still be maybe even having to produce something in Excel, or maybe they use PowerPoint or Keynote. You want to keep these same principles in mind. So let me share an analogy why I say that visualization is a language, okay? And it's more than just about learning how to use software features and functions. So imagine that your company wants you to be good at writing. So they train you on every feature and function of Microsoft Word. You are an expert in that software. But they don't actually teach you anything about the language of your country. They don't teach you how to construct a sentence. They don't tell you how to write a story. So this is a little confusing. And maybe you figured it out. It's really this famous phrase, which is easier to understand. And this is the thing we talk about when you're using language. This is what's happened to all of us, right? We've all been trained on the software. We're really good at it, or we're learning to be better at it. But you weren't actually trained on the language of visualization or storytelling or data literacy. Maybe you got some best practices, but that's not the same. So it doesn't really matter how many buttons you click in the software. Your visualizations aren't going to have the same power towards helping people make decisions and take action, which is really what, of course, all of us want to do. And the problem is management, for some reason, thinks that the software is going to be the thing that magically helps us be good at writing stories. And of course, we know that that's really not the way it works. So we're really missing a lot of really big opportunities to make our data more actionable. What I like to say is it's really all about decision-making and action-taking. So before we dive into a couple of case studies, I want to tell you a little bit about how the brain works. So we actually recognize very complex patterns in the blink of an eye. So think about it this way, and this is a really strange thing. Our brains are working on images as soon as we see them. So in a way, we're thinking about what it means before using effort to think about it. So why is this phrase important? If we're not showing information to our audience in a way that really communicates that message very clearly, or the information is just confusing itself, it's going to slow them down. It means it's going to take them longer to decipher the meaning of that. And if they're struggling, they might just decide to ignore it, right? Which is, of course, that's the worst thing. So we really have to find ways to harness this processing power that our brains have. And it's going to let us not only communicate better, but go through a lot of information much faster and get to making those decisions. So what's going on inside our heads that lets us see these patterns? And let's talk about what those patterns are. And I mentioned there's 5 of the most common ones. You may not have actually thought about these as patterns until I bring it up now. You may have heard it called some other things that are a little bit more technical as well, like pre-attentive attributes and so forth, but I like to just keep them real simple. So we have location, size, and gradient, which sometimes is called color intensity. Then there's color, which is sometimes called color hue. And I'm going to talk about the difference between these two, and shape. And your brain, of course, isn't looking just for each of these alone. It can actually handle it when they're combined, which of course we do in visualizations. And the reason it's important that you understand these and how to work with them is that you're not just going to be clicking the software going, oh, let me make size, let me make color. You're actually going to understand how these work and be able to make better choices in the software itself. Now, most of us find Tableau pretty easy to use. However, that's not necessarily a good thing. So let me explain what I mean. So when we're using this software, we tend to treat these 5 traits and all the other options we have equally, because as I mentioned, we can just take a click and any of those go right into a chart. The thing is, these traits are not equal because some are easier for our brain to process, and this is the key thing. So the fact that some of these are easier to process than others is what you can think of as a hierarchy, not a technical hierarchy like in Tableau, just that some are easier and harder. So consider this example. Depending what you're trying to communicate, maybe you're going to use size before you use gradients, and you would use color before using shapes. So the challenge is when you start to create visuals that don't follow this idea of the hierarchy, meaning you're using certain elements that are harder for the brain to process when you could be used something that's easier, it causes your audience to work harder to figure out what that message is and how to interpret the visual. Or maybe they're going to interpret it incorrectly. And for people like us who are analysts, that's the worst case of all, right? So let's jump in to breaking down a few dashboards and where they don't follow the hierarchy, and then how you can actually clear these up and think about improving the data literacy of them. Now, outside of using the software incorrectly, and we know that there's lots of different ways we can do that, one of the biggest problems I see is designers and engineers creating lots of data tables and they're not using the software to create visualization. So I'm sure all of you have seen something like this. And the problem is that data tables kind of lure us into many bad behaviors. And you can unlearn these. So, for example, one thing is just showing too much information about a single data metric or a number. In this case, I don't think that seeing buildings and inspections down to single digits really affects how someone's going to make a decision about what they're seeing. You could just use 6 million. It's just as good. And same for all the other numbers on this page, because what's happening is you have too much data and it's going to overwhelm the people who are trying to actually use this for making some kind of decision, gathering some kind of insight. And here's the other thing. If we look at these tables on the page, this one's alphabetical. This one is sorted high to low. And actually this one I couldn't figure out. I actually tried for quite a while. I just didn't know what was going on there. So I made an alternate version that starts to follow some of the rules that you want to do to harness the pattern recognition that your brain has. So let's talk about how it compares. First, you'll see that there's a lot less color here. In fact, I've really only used color, actually in our terms, we've used gradients on this one part of the page, and the rest kind of has a neutral gray. Because colors, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, are really to highlight information, okay? And I've used some bar charts instead of all those tables of numbers. I've tried to reduce the scrolling, and in another case, I used a line chart instead of a bar chart because we wanted to show trends, which is going to be easier. So this is just a very simple example to get us going. What I really want to point out is when you're looking at tables of data, you're not really using visualization, even though that's kind of what people think. They're using visualization software, so that's included. But I would say that think about using a data table as kind of your last option for displaying information, because you're really missing the value of how to use that. And it's not your fault. Maybe it's what you've learned. Maybe it's what your management wants you to do. But let's take a look at how we can start changing in other ways, getting rid of these data tables. One of the most common metrics that you probably work with and that I see in a table is people will put something that's a time value into a table. And now you're expected to see patterns and trends within all of that. And there's quite a lot of information here. In fact, this data, you're not even seeing all the data because it scrolls, right? And clearly, or you would think that if you're trying to look at something over time, you want to see how the patterns are changing, and that would be much better as a line chart. And also, we have to get rid of this scrolling somehow, right? Because if we can't see all the information at once, how are we going to analyze it? So I want to introduce an interesting idea for you to think about when not just working with data tables, but also working with any kind of visualization in general, but it's just going to come into play in this example. This is that same data table. And it allows you to see all the data elements, the timeline, the totals, and the category totals. And here's what's different than how many of us actually approach the work of visualization and thinking about charts. Here, it's actually two charts put together to look like one. A lot of what people do is say, I want to put everything into one chart. And that's either why they end up with a data table, or they end up with a much more complex visual because they want everything to be in that one chart, or in Tableau terms, right, in one worksheet. But if you can think about how to combine them and how to get that data simplified, but still present it in a way that's very clear, you can do that by having multiple worksheets and put them together. The user doesn't know that it's more than one. To them, this looks like one cohesive image. So think about that. It's a bit of a twist on how you might approach your work on a day-to-day basis. And here's another way to look at that same set of data. Imagine that instead of seeing trends, you rather see patterns, okay? And in this case, right, we've got the low end for a gradient is yellow, so I can see where all of the lower values are, and then I can quickly see where the higher values are by this green. And we've just got these marks to show us where the highest and lowest values are. It's a good reference point. Here's another thing to think about. Depending on what information you're trying to convey and what message you want to deliver, you could use this highlight chart and the line chart on the same dashboard. And a lot of times people won't do that because they'll say, well, it's just the same information. It's the same data. Yes, that's true. But in a line chart, like we just saw, you're really looking at a trend, right? And you can see that instantly. Here, you really want to look for patterns and groupings. It's not the same. You're not really looking as much at a trend here. So you have to think about what's the message you're trying to get across? How do you want people to interpret it? And that's really going to influence the type of chart that you choose. Not just because it looks better or some other reason. You have to really be very purposeful. And that's how you can understand how to manipulate these kinds of things. So think about using more than one chart on the same page to do the same thing. Now, as I said, I want to talk about color a little bit more because that is really something that I would say is most used, but also most abused. And on this particular dashboard, and this is a real dashboard, you're using the same sets of colors to represent 4 completely different sets of information. So what happens here is your brain says, oh, I see blues, I see purples, and it thinks they're related because it's the same color, but there are really no connections. So not only can it be confusing, people might actually draw ideas out of this that are just wrong. And of course, we don't want that to happen. So colors are very powerful, but you really want to use them in your design so that they are getting the right message across. So let's see what we can do to this one to improve it and simplify it. So what are some of the key things to look out for that maybe you would be abusing colors? One is just using too many gradients or colors on the same dashboard. And what happens is then nothing stands out. And it's hard to know what's important because you're really trying to use color to, or you should be trying to use color to make an emphasis. As I mentioned, maybe you're using the same gradient or color to represent more than one thing. We talked about why that's a problem. Or maybe you're just using color when it's not needed. And again, if your audience sees the color, they're saying must mean something. It must mean something important because that's what their brain is telling them. And again, you don't want to confuse them. I could probably go on and list probably a good dozen other things, but we don't have time for that. I want to show you how to fix a couple of these things. So what can you do instead of a pie chart? Well, something simple you can do is turn that into a bar chart. And I'm not going to get into details of why you might want to do that, but this is just one of the key takeaways. This bar chart, I thought about this and said, well, I don't want to just use these blues again because I've got a lot of other blues. How can I talk about upstream and downstream? So maybe those are better represented by these kinds of colors. They have a little bit more meaning behind them. This bubble chart, it's kind of the same things around like a pie chart. They can be a little difficult to work with. So again, try to convert that to a bar chart. And this tree map actually has geographic information in it. It would just be better as a map. Now, this is dramatically different than that other one. The other one was filled with colors, right? Maybe it looked pretty. It used, pie charts and bar charts and tree maps and bubble charts. They got all of it in there, right? But it doesn't make it easier for the user to look at it and to interpret it. And that's really what your goal is. So when you understand this whole idea about the language of visualization, it's going to be easier to create this kind of visual because you're going to be thinking, how do I make it easier? How do I use that hierarchy and use the simpler things on the hierarchy rather than the harder things that are more difficult for the brain to interpret? Now, I just want to emphasize that point about color when I introduce the hierarchy, because it really means two things, although when we say color, we tend to just mean color in general. So there's this idea of gradients, which is really measuring different shades of a single color or multiple colors. And then there's unique colors, which represent values of a dimension, okay? So for gradients, you're using measures, and color, you're using dimensions in terms of how you think about it in Tableau. Now in Tableau, you can actually apply dimensions on gradients and vice versa, but you shouldn't because it's not what the brain is expecting. So even though it's technically possible, you're going to look at it and your brain's going to go, wait a second, that doesn't make sense to me, okay? And the other thing is about color, like we saw in the past, is a lot of times what you should be doing is only using it in a very minimal way, as I am here. I believe I'm using it in a minimal way to point out something, to make it stand out. You can see I've started to use these neutral grays when it's not something that you have to really differentiate the information. The worst thing you can do is say, I'm going to use color or gradients or anything else to make the page look pretty. I would say that's when your trouble is really going to start. I'm going to just finish up with this last one, then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. So in this one, you can tell that the author really likes blue. It's everywhere. It's in the visuals and the headings. And in this case, strangely, there's no color legends. So you don't even know what these things are. You're just going to have to make it up. And you're probably going to guess wrong. So I actually went into the workbook and found what the colors meant and layered it back in here. So you can start to see some problems. Again, it's like before, some of the colors and gradients are representing different information on multiple charts. So you can't really figure out what's going on or make decisions, right? So how can we adjust some of these kinds of things? Here's a line chart. And in this case, what you're doing is you're actually using a couple of different of the traits here, right? You're using location, which is kind of the time factor, and then you're adding the gradients in. And it can be difficult at times when you're using these multiple traits. And that's why I wanted you to think about them as individual traits, because if you do something like this, you should be saying, how can I make this easier? How can I use individual traits in that hierarchy to do something that's going to be maybe more straightforward and then hopefully simpler to get the message across? So in this case, again, it's that idea of using two charts. It's not bad to use two charts, especially if it makes it simpler. So again, here you can see the trend, right? Very clear where it's going. And then you can see in this separate video or separate visual where you're highlighting the changes positive, or if you wanted to, maybe the messages you want to highlight where it's negative, and maybe you would use a red instead of the gray. You just kind of reverse those. So that's one spot. Let's look at another example. This one is trying to show a relationship between two values. So you've got the gradient and the bars are representing different measures. Now, again, this can be hard to process for someone who's, say, an average user of visualization. Maybe if you're a more advanced analyst, you'd be really good at it. So when I think about relationships of two values, I think first XY plot. So if I made this into an XY plot, which is location, X and Y, right? That's the easiest one in the hierarchy. Now I can see there's a cluster here. It's only 3, but we'll call them a cluster. And then there's these two outliers. And now it's much easier for me to see these relationships and where I may want to investigate these a little bit further. All this is much easier thinking about how to use that hierarchy and get to the simpler traits. So just to finish off, here's the original one. And then here's something, I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but you can look at it later, about reimagining the whole thing using some of these principles that I went over. Of course, the difference is very broad here, but think about which one you may want to show to your boss or your clients. They're still using some color in here, but the blue is really used more for using to differentiate between where each of these levels of the visuals are. It's a much cleaner layout. I've actually put the summary information into the titles instead of having it just kind of take up big blocks. You can line the filters, label all the values clearly, things like that. The point is of all of this is understanding that this is a language and thinking about it as how you want to speak to people. Think about the message that you want your visual to convey. And that's how you then start to use the hierarchy and determine which of the elements you want to use. If you'd like to just get a separate copy of that hierarchy to just have handy, just shoot me an email to 5@decisionviz.com and put the word yes in the subject line. And maybe we can send this as a follow-up from this meeting too, so you don't have to worry about trying to do that now. I'll make sure you get a copy that you can use. If you want to get a hold of me, lots of different ways. On my website, you can email me, you can follow me on Twitter, you can find me on LinkedIn. Happy to talk about any of the things that we covered today. I know we just touched on a lot of important information at a very high level. So let me stop, and I know we'll have a few minutes for Q&A.
Sounds great. Thanks, Lee. We did just have a question pop in. David is asking, what is your opinion of using a pale color, like a light blue or light green, instead of a neutral gray? It can feel like it's a background color to some people. Curious your thoughts on that.
Sure. Fair question. I think you can use that, one, if you're consistent with it, say across all of your work, so that people get the idea that, yes, I'm using this very pale color to kind of, I don't want it to really draw attention to it, but it's there. The second thing is, again, if you're using a pale blue and say on the page you have a darker blue, now you essentially have a gradient. So you may have an unintentional relationship being formed when someone looks at that. So you have to be pretty careful when you go into that.
Great. Well, thank you. That was great. We will definitely make sure we include the information you shared at the end there. And then Lee, are you going to share, are you willing to share these slides with the group as well?
The slides, not as much, actually.
Okay, totally fine. So we will make sure we include your contact information in our recap for everybody, and they can reach out for that then. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Thank you.
All right. We have just a few minutes left with you all. A few things to cover, some upcoming events, Tableau related in general. We've got the All Wisconsin Tug. So, you know, we have every month something new for our friends in Wisconsin, whether it's from the Milwaukee Tug, Wisconsin Tug, or the Madison Tug. So it's great to join forces with other Tableau user groups and share content. Hopefully you've been taking advantage of those. So in July, we've got the Wisconsin Tug meeting coming up, potentially that networking event that we told you about earlier. In August is the Milwaukee Tug meeting. September is our next meeting. We do plan to have some tutorial-based, hands-on, maybe type of activities. If you have something you would like to share with your fellow data fam, we would encourage you to throw your name in the chat or reach out to one of us on the leadership team. You'll see our names in just a second. And we can talk about what the options are there. Alternatively, if you don't have something you want to present, but there's something that you're just dying to know that you think is conducive to, you know, a short tutorial or hands-on type of session, let us know what that topic might be. And then we do have word that Tableau conference will be virtual again this year in November. I think that's the extent that we know so far. So keep an eye on the Tableau community pages, of course, and all the social media channels for more information there. And of course, we will share information as we have it too. You can follow the Madison Tableau user group calendar at the link here on the bottom of the slide. Once you go to that link, you can also link to other tugs, and that's where you can look up the Milwaukee dates and topics and things like that and get registered. Also related, just a quick plug that data, the Iron Viz competition, there is a qualifier event that is open right now through this month. I believe the deadline's early July. The topic for your viz is data plus joy. You're supposed to viz about things you love. So I think on this blog post, which is linked in the bottom here, they talk about like, do you love Nutella? Create a blog about Nutella. So that one spoke to me personally. But I would encourage you to check that out if you're at all inclined to just throw your name in just for fun and see what happens. You never know. Lots of big prizes in store, and of course some awesome notoriety that comes along with that. And now we are set to do some e-learning giveaways. So Pat has been diligently, I hope, keeping track of engagement throughout our event, and will have 3 winners drawn. You do need to be present to win. With that, Pat, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So yeah, I won't let you down, Sarah. I was paying attention and randomly chose 3 winners from all the people that were interacting during the presentations. And those, I'll email each of you with the e-learning code, but the 3 winners, and forgive me if I forgive my pronunciation, but Kashinath Shanagaram, Ginger Castle, and David Weller. Congrats. The certificate's good for a year. And if you don't need it for whatever reason, let me know and I'll give it out to someone else. But thanks for joining us. And another quick plug for the Wisconsin Tug in July. You'll be seeing more communications around that, but we've got 2 rock star presenters. One is from the Green Bay Packers, Garrison Cummings, presenting on the voice of the fan. And the other is a Hall of Fame Zen master, Steve Wexler, presenting on inspiring change with data visualization. So won't want to miss that. Thanks
Great
much.
speakers. Awesome. Thanks, Pat. Well, last but not least, on the screen, you see your Madison Tug leadership team. If you ever feel inspired and would like some extracurricular activities in your time, reach out. We have a good group, but new talent and ideas are always welcome. So reach out if you'd like to chat. And then, of course, social media. We've got a Madison Tug Twitter channel, and we also use hashtag Madison Tug. And our LinkedIn group. So with that, we will close out for the day. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and we will see you next time.